I'd like to start with a question. What would you do if Warner Brothers called you today and said, hey, we'd like you to make the next Batman game. We'd like you to come up with the story and the gameplay and the whole pitch overall. It can be an Arkham game, it can be a new continuity, it can be a Gotham Knights tie-in, it can be whatever you want it to be, but let's hear it. Today, I'd like to go through what my pitch would be for that imaginary circumstance that I'm sure will never happen unless I'm very, very lucky. Today, I'd like to give you guys my pitch, and while I do that, I'd like for you to think about what you would want to put in a new Batman game. And if you'd like, feel free to leave it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your ideas as well, as I'm about to share mine. First, I want to talk about the open world Gotham City that I would implement. I think that so much has been done right in the Batman games, particularly in the Arkham franchise, and Gotham Knights is dropping here within the next few days, and so we'll get to see how they are handling Gotham City. In terms of what I would do if I were in charge of a Batman game, it would have the largest land mass or width of any Gotham City that has ever appeared in a game. Not only would the size of the map be bigger than anything we've seen before, but the verticality of the city would be bigger than anything we've ever seen before. The city would be full of towering skyscrapers like we saw in Batman '89. They would stretch high beyond the streets of Gotham, and you as Batman would be able to grapple and glide between them, but you would also have some vehicular transportation. In some of the more dead areas of Gotham, in the Narrows, in the suburbs, in the less highly populated areas, you'd be able to drive the Batmobile, the Batbike. On the waterfront, you'd be able to drive the Batboat, and then on the mainland, where there's traffic jams in a highly populated city, you'd be able to fly the Batwing between buildings. This mainland would also serve for an interesting challenge in terms of stealth. As Batman, you don't want to be spotted by too many civilians, you don't want the cops after you. It could create a Grand Theft Auto type wanted system where if too many people see you or if you're seen beating up criminals, the GCPD could be called, you could be cited as disturbing the peace, and the police would be after you. They'd chase you in cars and helicopters, and it would make for a very challenging escape. For the less densely populated areas of Gotham, it would feel like a more traditional Batman game. You'd be able to drop down to the streets, walk around as Batman without any issues, without the police being called. This is where crime would run rampant. This is where you'd have looters, people trying to start fires. I'd want there to be all of those crimes that you just ran into in the Arkham games, but I'd like there to be more variety. I'd like you to have criminals trying to take hostages, or trying to set bombs off in the city, or trying to start fires like I mentioned, or robbing banks, or looting, or vandalizing, and just giving players some agency in terms of what they want to take down. I'd also want to keep what they are implementing in Gotham Knights, where you can learn about premeditated crimes that are going to happen and go and use your prep time to set up a way to take them down more easily. On top of that, in terms of bigger main side missions with supervillains and boss battles, I'd like to change the approach to that as well and make you feel more like a detective and also Batman in terms of planning and strategizing your methods. First, the side missions would open with Batman going to a crime scene that had been reported by the GCPD. For argument's sake, let's just say Mr. Freeze is the subject of this side mission. You'd first go to a crime scene where people have been cryogenically frozen, you do your data analysis, and you learn that Mr. Freeze has a cryogenic freeze gun. You could take that information back to the Batcave, and you could modify your suit to be able to withstand the freeze blasts from Mr. Freeze. You then return to the city, and you'd have a little bit of choice depending on the side mission. You could go and you could figure out where Mr. Freeze is hiding, and you could just jump in and try to take him down, or you could be smarter. You could go find 3 different Mr. Freeze thugs, you could interrogate each of them, and as you interrogated them, you'd learn more about his case file, you'd learn about his strengths, you'd learn that melee combat against Mr. Freeze is not a good idea, but you'd maybe learn that he is really sensitive to heat, and then you could go back to the Batcave again and modify your gadgetry to apply heat to it. So your batarangs could be heat batarangs, or your Batclaw could have a heat component to it as well, where you could rip off pieces of his suit. And there could be multiple ways to take down each enemy. For example, if Bane is a supervillain that you have to take down in a side mission, you could learn that he is really vulnerable to stealth, and so then you could create a suit that is quieter and more agile. Or you could try to take him on hand-to-hand. You could modify your suit to take a lot of damage and to be really heavy and deal a lot of damage, but to then be really slow in attacks. And I feel that this would offer the player some really great gameplay choice in terms of how they want to modify their playstyle, both when they're just going around the city, but then also when they are taking on specific threats. I also feel that having the variety and traversal would create some really unique and dynamic chase sequences. If you are in the Batboat, you could chase down Falcone or Penguin's yachts that are just roaming the waterfront, or if you're on land and in the Batmobile, then you could chase convoys around with drugs or something. And then if you're in the Batwing, you could be chasing Firefly or helicopters around and trying to stop crime from happening in the air. And it would make all of Gotham, from the streets to the top of the skylines, full of crime and corruption for you to root out. I'd also want the sewers to be fully realized. Maybe there could be a subway system as well. I also feel that it could be really interesting to have some Bruce Wayne gameplay. You could go to socialite events, you could meet some of the big players of Gotham in an almost Telltale-like way. You could go and meet Harvey Dent, and you could even choose to support him like you did in Batman Telltale, or you could choose to push him off, and that could change your relationship with him. You could talk to your employees at Wayne Enterprises, and many of them could be characters who will later become villains in the story. Maybe Jonathan Crane and Pamela Isley work at Wayne Enterprises, and you could get some foreshadowing, and you could learn more about them, and you could learn about some of their strengths and weaknesses there when they're working for you before they transition into villainy. Throughout the story as Bruce Wayne, you could even upgrade the city. You could send your resources to the GCPD or to Arkham Asylum, and doing so would give you different buffs. Maybe if you sent resources to the GCPD, there would be less crime in the air because they could put more police helicopters in the air, but then you'd maybe have more police helicopters after you as Batman, so you'd have to weigh the pros and cons of each decision that you made. Maybe if you sent resources to Arkham Asylum, you'd have less escaped patients that could break out over the course of the open world gameplay or the story, but then you'd potentially have more crime in the city that would be as a result, since the resources are going there instead of to the police who are keeping crime off the streets. In terms of story-based side missions that wouldn't just be boss fights for you to find in the city, I would like them to be longer than we saw on average in the Arkham games. I'd of course still put in a handful of just fun encounters with villains that you could find, or collectibles similar to Riddler trophies, but it could also be fun to have Cold Heart-like stories that are just in the base game that you can go find for various criminals. And maybe every time you take down a criminal or a supervillain or a boss fight, you could collect something from them and upgrade your gadgetry or apply a modification to your suit based on that. And that would give you way more investment in taking out these criminals. You'd feel the corruption fall and your power rise, and you'd feel the power dynamic shift. I'd also want the player to be able to select Batman as a playable character, Robin as a playable character, Catwoman as a playable character, and Batgirl as a playable character. These are the four that I'd want to be available to roam the city as, and also I'd want there to be some dual play mechanics. And when you're doing your prep to take down big enemies, you could even select another companion to go with you as AI, or potentially even in multiplayer, where the two of you could fight to take down a boss. So as Batman, you could go solo if that's your preferred playstyle, or you could have Robin tag along or Batgirl tag along with you. And I feel, again, this just would create so many dynamic encounters, and you could replay the game and try out different techniques and try out different builds, and it would just create a more dynamic open world than we saw in some of the previous Batman games. That's how I'd try to evolve the gameplay going forward. In terms of combat and traversal, I think the Arkham games did a great job. I'd try to implement those to a degree. I'd try to keep the basics of free flow combat, but change it up a bit so that it feels new and fresh. And in terms of traversal, again, the vehicular transportation would be improved and new. I wouldn't have tank fights from the Batmobile, so I think players would appreciate me for that. In terms of grappling and gliding around the city, I think that was done really well in the Arkham games. I'd keep it pretty similar to how it was done there, but I'd add a parkour system for Robin and Catwoman. For Batman and Batgirl, I would sort of modify the traversal style just based on the city and the scale. I'd maybe speed up their gliding if it warranted it, or maybe I'd even give the player a little bit of control over the acceleration of how fast they are gliding. I think that there are just little improvements that could be made here or there. Now, in terms of the continuity and the main story itself, I would actually set this as a soft reboot between Arkham Origins and Arkham Asylum. What I mean by that is I wouldn't contradict the events that took place in Arkham Origins, and I would potentially even make some light references to them, but it wouldn't be dependent on that story either. This wouldn't pick up where Arkham Origins left off. It would start as its own standalone story. It wouldn't contradict anything that necessarily comes later in Arkham Asylum. Again, it would just be a very standalone story, but the whole point is that that I would want the story to begin as kind of a crime story, like The Long Halloween. I'd want the Falcones and the Maronis and the Thorns and all of those guys playing roles in Gotham City. You'd have Oswald Cobblepot, and you'd have a few heavy hitters here or there, but primarily it's a gang war with some of these not very superpowered enemies. But by the end of the story, I'd want Batman to be going up against Two-Face, Harley Quinn, Poison Ivy, Man-Bat, Killer Croc, all of these big heavy-hitting supervillains. The era that I'd want this game to cover is the rise of Batman from a myth to a legend, and his sidekicks from being just in his shadow to becoming their own defined heroes in the city. I'd want the corruption to rise from just being underneath the surface to being supervillains, to being very abundant. And I'd want to take the story from the early days of Batman to the height of Batman's lore and the most traditional Batman stories. In many ways, I feel like this would be the Batman game to end all Batman games. I'd want it to have every Batman feature that any player could possibly want, and I'd want the story to include so many plot points, so many characters that fans have been begging for. I'd want Prometheus in the game. I'd want the Ventriloquist and Scarface to make an appearance in the game. I'd want the Great White Shark in there. I'd want this to just be a love letter to Batman fans and have just all the villains that people love. I'd love for the story to go over Robin's origin, show the death of his parents, and show Batman training him to his crusade, and showing the father-son dynamic that comes from that, showing how Barbara Gordon chooses to be a hero, and even showing how Catwoman chooses to leave behind some of her shadier thieving ways so that she can help with Batman's crusade as well. I just feel like this is a story that hasn't really been told in games yet, and it has a lot of ground that it could cover and a lot of gameplay potential, and just to see the height of Batman's career in games would be really fun. So that's the game I would make. Again, feel free to leave in the comments below what your ideas would be. I also think a Batman Beyond game would be really fun, but that's a different video for another day. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and thanks again so much for watching. We will see you guys in the next one.